let me start perhaps by making the point that there is a certain conceptual quagmire or conceptual complexity in this notion of Indian diasporas, more especially when we look at South Africa. Because in a country like South Africa, that's been so battered and bruised by race, by ethnicity, by identity, by authoritarian rule, this is one of the areas that we had to hurdle to be able to claim ourselves as being born of this soil. And so the Indian part of our identity is very much a cultural identity, a linguistic identity, in many ways, a faith identity that connects us with the Indian subcontinent. But at a broader level, I'm always charmed to quote the words of President Kwame Nkrumah, in which he said, "I am an African, not because I was born in Africa, but I am an African because Africa was born in me." And for the vast majority of us who are of Indian descent in South Africa, that is very much the identity that's embraced. That's not to say that there aren't allegiances along cultural and other lines, but just this whole idea of being secure in our South African nationhood is something that's a dominant feature of this community of close on 1.5 million that count ourselves as being of Indian origin. I want to maybe take us back to one of the themes that Ambassador Sachdev raised early on about the different phases of migration. And when we look at South Africa, I've identified 6 different phases in over a vast period. The first goes back more than a millennium, in which Dravidian gold miners are supposed to have trawled for gold on the southern in the southern part of Africa, connecting with the continent through what is modern day Maputo. And an outstanding book in that regard is by the historian Cyril Romnick, who looks at the Indo-African roots of various South African communities. Now, his argument has hardly been something embraced either by the white authoritarian establishment of 40 years ago, nor does it sit very comfortably with the African nationalist narrative. And when we get to questions of who built the country, again, questions of race, ethnicity, and identity, that throws a spanner in the works, as it were. But it's a very convincing narrative in which he uses linguistics in particular to demonstrate this apparent association, and words that have come into our languages, the cuisines, and so on. And it's a very convincing line. Another point that arises from that, for instance, he uses the example of the Mapungubwe gold rhinoceros, which is one of the earliest artifacts we have of Iron Age and smelting communities in the southern part of Africa. But that is a longer argument for another time, but I just wanted to identify that particular period as the Dravidian gold miners of more than a millennium ago. Then there's the second phase of slavery, and slavery to the Cape. Now, the Cape was initially a Dutch settlement and then subsequently an English one. 1652 was the first formal settlement or permanent settlement of the Dutch in the Cape, and that then in 1806 went to the British after the British and the Dutch fought over that colony. But what's operative for this period is the immense flow of slaves from the east to the Cape. Now, there's this notion that slaves at the Cape came largely from the East Indies, Malaya, Indonesia, and the like. But when one looks at the records, especially the baptism records and trade records even at the Cape, there is a case to be made that the vast majority of those slaves actually came from the Indian subcontinent. And names like Angela of Bengal, Cupido from Kerala, names from what later became Madras, are all very common in the makeup of the Cape people, even to this day. So that's another very valuable area in terms of looking at who or what makes up the South African nation. The third period, and this we speak of as the period of indenture, or as the historian Hugh Tinker called it, a new system of slavery. Now, for those of us of indentured Indian origin, we don't see this as a negative term. We recognize the oppressive labor practice, but we have immense pride in being people that originate among the working people of the plantations. And that's a very important political identity for us as well. And so 1860 to 1911, there were various waves of workers that were drafted in by the British to work the plantations of colonial Natal, as well as the mines, domestic service, and other areas. And all in all, we count something like 142,000 people who came largely from the southern part of India, but also some from the north, from Calcutta and from Madras, who are counted among the people who came here as indentured workers. And along with that, I find the next phase, or the fourth phase of migration, which are the traders who came largely from Gujarat to service mainly the needs of this Indian origin community on the plantations. A much smaller group of people, but distinct from a class point of view. And there remains a historic tension between the trader community and the community of indentured origins, who are the vast majority here. So that community came from around 1870, did not come up as dominant in the economy of the country as, for instance, Asians in the eastern part of Africa. Largely through restrictive legislation, they were prevented by racist legislation from growing their businesses and so on. So they were an important feature of the economy, but not as significant in the overall setup. The fifth wave are those soldiers that came as part of the British Indian Army, as part of the British forces in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879-1880, and subsequently the Anglo-Boer War of 1899 to 1902. And for instance, there's a community that very distinctly identifies themselves as originating among the Pathan fighters who came as part of the British Army. So that's very small, but yet a distinct element. And the sixth group are largely whom we identify as Indian expatriates today, who came here after the defeat of apartheid in 1990. So overall, that's the larger part of the migration, although the last one we don't count as necessarily as part of this 1.5 million people who are registered on the census as being of Indian origin. Now, the main point, or main area that I want to focus on in this short time is the fact of the dominant narrative in South Africa as being that of the participation in the freedom struggle. So this large community of Indian origin is very distinct from those in Eastern Africa or Western Africa, in that we who are of Indian origins count ourselves as a working class community. And if one were to do an economic analysis of that community today, it's overwhelmingly a working class. People who've come up from the plantations and through various mechanisms, principally formal education, have been able to uplift themselves and their families. So you see a dominant presence of, and to use Ambassador Sachdev's point, a credible presence in South Africa of this working class community who, having come from the plantations, got themselves involved in the political movements, going all the way to 1894 with Gandhi's founding of the Natal Indian Congress, but also in the 1920s, 1930s, and later in the trade union movements. And at every step in the struggle against racism and against apartheid, people of Indian origin stood up to be counted. So we had the trade unions, we had the Communist Party, the Congress alliance of the Natal Indian Congress and the Transvaal Indian Congress, together with the African National Congress. So Indian people as activists were part of, for instance, the 1946 passive resistance, which had a profound impact on the trajectory of the freedom struggle in South Africa. And just as an aside, Professor Daswani, that picture that you showed of your grandfather with the Indian diplomat, that's Mrs. Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit, who was very important in our political history, in that in 1946, she was the diplomat at the United Nations who moved the resolution in the UN condemning racism in South Africa, which led to sanctions being imposed against the South African government, the white South African government that predated the apartheid government that came into power in 1948. So a very important personality in our overall trajectory. But just overall, through these various periods, we've seen people of Indian origin locate themselves in every one of the struggles that were waged by the majority African people in our country. The argument was always that African people had to be at the forefront of the struggle, but as South Africans, myself, fifth generation, at every step, every one of these generations found themselves at various points of struggle. And if we look, for instance, at the population on Robben Island during the freedom struggle, there was a disproportionate number of people of Indian origin who found themselves imprisoned with people like Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and others. So it's a very proud history that we're able to look back on. Further than that, we found that after the Sharpeville massacre of 1960, in which the apartheid forces mowed down innocent protesters, the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress were banned. And various of the leadership of those movements either was convicted and sent to Robben Island or went into exile. And in the exile community, and we found ourselves all over the African continent, in Ghana, in Tanzania, in Zambia, later in Zimbabwe, and also in the United States and Europe and in India also, and amazing solidarity and support from the Indian government. In fact, there's a wonderful story told, which I shared with Dr. Modi, that when President Oliver Tambo arrived in Dar es Salaam, Prime Minister Nehru sent Krishna Menon with blank passports and said, Oliver Tambo has arrived in Dar es Salaam, take these passports to him and have them fill in their names. And there are various key figures in our freedom struggle who look back on that enormous solidarity and support from the government and people of India. But even beyond this phase of exile and imprisonment, we also had people participate in the Black consciousness movement led by Steve Biko. So the point I want to make with that is that in spite of the Congress movement led by the African National Congress as having been the dominant movement, people of Indian origin found themselves right across the political spectrum. So in identifying as Black, we took that as a political identity in the opposition to racism. And so the overall picture of activism in South Africa can be seen across this vast area. And latterly, in the period since the defeat of apartheid, people of Indian origin have found themselves as active participants in government. In President Mandela's first cabinet, there was a large number of people of Indian origin who were cabinet ministers, and working hand in hand with majority Africans in our country to be able to be part of this reconstruction and development. So in summary then, I would argue that people of Indian origin in South Africa, far from being a diaspora of India, maybe of Indian origin, but count ourselves as very much part of an African population on the southern tip of India, of Africa, but being very mindful and cherishing this long heritage and umbilical cord almost to the Indian subcontinent, but secure in our identity as South Africans. And incidentally, we were stateless people throughout this period from 1860 right until 1961, when rather bizarrely, it was the apartheid government that granted citizenship to people of Indian origin. And after 1990, we were all able to take our place as democrats and freedom-loving people when we eventually had our democratic elections in 1994.